Okay, shall we start or?
Well, yes, I think that we're all ready to start. Let me just introduce you since I'm supposed to be the moderator of this session. We have two presentations, unfortunately or maybe fortunately because this gives us more time for discussion, because Ivan will not be here. So we have a first presentation by Steve Keen on a monetary Minsky model of the Great Moderation and the Great Recession, and then we will have a presentation of Kurt Mettenheim on financial roads to social economies. Apparently different contributions, so I'm sure that there will be interesting connections, given that both these contributions bring us to the basics of what the financial system is about. So, Steve?
Thank you. I'm just one reason I have as much software as I have is I don't trust computers. And this computer software package I was about to use to record my screen has just crashed on me. So I'm now going to be relying, let's see, this actually will work. I doubt it. Let's see, I press the record button and nothing happens. It's hung. Great. Okay, so much for that. Well, I better start live in that case. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation, first of all, from the organisers of this particular panel. I'm talking on a slightly different topic to what I said I'd be using in the abstract itself, so I'll be talking more about why neoclassical economics has to go rather than modelling, but I'll do both in this presentation. And I've just finished writing a second edition of my book, Debunking Economics. And in writing it, one thing which occurred to me is this paradoxical but quite transcendental truth, and that is that neoclassical economists don't understand neoclassical economics. If they did, they couldn't possibly practice it. And you'll find this in the literature now that's turning up as we see the crisis unfolding. And here's an example of the attitude that the editor of the AER macro had prior to the crisis in a punchline. The state of macro was good. Published, unfortunately, right in the middle of the recorded downturn. And he argued in favour of what he called the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, which is the basis of real trade theory and all that nonsense, saying it's simple, analytically convenient, and it's replaced the ISLM model, and its great advantage is that it's derived formally rather than informally from optimisation by firms and consumers, seeing that as an advantage. After the crisis, he sort of realised things weren't quite so good, saying that the Great Moderation lulled us into believing we knew what we were doing, but he said, of course, we have to question that, but of course we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. The baby, of course, being the neoclassical models completely failed to anticipate the crisis. And in fact, we're predicting smooth travels ahead. To quote another one of my favourite statements about the crisis, the OECD Outlook came out saying that our outlook was quite benign. That was published in June of 2007. That is neoclassical economics, macro in particular, is a baby that should never have been conceived in the first place. And to show why, that's a major part of the new edition of Debunking Economics is to cover that. The base model of the dynamic stochastic GE model is the Solow-Ramsey growth model. And you might not know it, but Robert Solow rejects DSGE models completely. I'll take a few quotes and show you that basis. And the real reason, one of the many reasons they're fallacious, is they commit the fallacy of strong reductionism, which is to argue that the macroeconomics is simply applied micro. Now, there's good proof in neoclassical theory that that's simply impossible, but nonetheless they carry on as if it is possible. Now, I cover this in more detail in Debunking Economics, but I've got time to go through a bit through here since we only have two presenters. So here's Robert Solow writing in 2001, saying that this is describing what the prototypical real business cycle model is like now. And he goes through saying that it has a single immortal household, who's the representative consumer, who's the only worker in the only firm, which runs competitive competition, in which he makes a decision to supply labour on a labour-leisure trade-off, blah, blah, blah. And he said this is nothing but the neoclassical growth model. And they'd all admit that. Now, he said when he built that model, it was clear to him that one thing it didn't apply to was short-term fluctuations. But he said if you take a look at any article now calling itself an article in the business cycle, it'll be a slightly dressed-up model of that growth model. And he said, how on earth did this happen? Now, he said, well, one of the reasons people might say this is that, well, if you're going to have theoretically sound macroeconomics, you must use the Ramsey growth model as your descriptive foundation. And saying there's no other way to reach the claims of micro theory, seeing microeconomics and macro as integrated whole, as neoclassicals do. And he said that claim is a delusion. This is Robert Solow. This is not no second-rate non-neoclassical economist or a third-rate neoclassical. This is a Nobel Prize-winning guy whose models were used as the basis for this entire scheme. And he says that the reason we know this is not true is the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu conditions. Now, anybody in this room know what they are? Okay, that's one reason I'm covering this part now. These are a set of conditions which are discovered as long ago as the year of my birth, 1953, that the demand curve for a single market in general equilibrium can have any polynomial shape at all. It does not have to be, and in fact normally cannot be, the smooth downward sloping line that neoclassicals draw for all market demand curves. So not only can you not reduce macro to the behaviour of a single agent, you can't even derive the behaviour of a single market using neoclassical utility maximising concepts. But they model the entire economy that way. Now the basis for it, the basic story is that the law of demand, inverted commas, is the argument that as the price falls, the demand will rise. And there's a huge amount of calisthenics involved in neoclassical micro, which they normally teach only in master's and PhD courses these days, to derive a Hicksian compensated downward sloping market demand curve for a single utility maximising consumer, and then jump over most of the time how do you sum those up to get a market demand curve. Now, even if you do have individuals who can be described that way, and I also argue in the book Empirical that's nonsense, but even if you did have agents like that, then the demand curve you would get of adding, say, Robinson Crusoe to Man Friday, where they both were utility maximising neoclassical consumers with downward sloping individual demand curves, the market demand curve would look like this. Of course, under those conditions, you can't do equilibrium analysis to begin with. Which intersection, once I draw supply curves in there, which intersection would you actually be regarding as the equilibrium? You can't do it anymore. Now, it's proof by contradiction. You start by assuming that market demand curves do obey the law of demand, and you then derive the conditions under which that is true, and you find those conditions contradict your initial assumptions. Now, that's what it actually was. Neoclassicals don't actually realise that, but fundamentally what they've done is the same thing Pythagoreans did, again by accident, back in the early days of mathematics, to prove that the square root of 2 is not a rational number, it's not the ratio of two integers. Now, the logic I cover in full in Debunking Economics, but I'll cover a bit of it here. Is there other presenter here, by the way?
Sorry?
Is there other presenter here? Okay, good. I won't take too much extra time. So the law of demand is derived from taking a Hicksian compensated demand curve. You take a well-behaved individual utility function, you vary the price, and what you get out of that is a range of price and demand intersections, which of course in this particular case ends up with the income and substitution effect being confused. What you can then do later is take care of that particular element. But the argument is you can vary price first of all without altering income, and therefore that pivot point on the vertical axis doesn't move. That's essential in deriving the downward sloping individual demand curve. Then you can compensate for the income effects by when you take a new price ratio, you return that price ratio until it's tangential to the original utility curve, so there's no income effect. So you can do that, and therefore you derive a Hicksian compensated individual demand curve which necessarily slopes down for any commodity whatsoever, including given goods. And that's the motivation, but the motivation behind what's called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu conditions research was to say, does this result survive aggregation? And the conclusion was no. What actually happens is that the facets you manage to ignore when you look at an individual can't be ignored when you look at more than one person. If you have two consumers in your economy, then there's going to be a different distribution of ownership of assets and different tastes. Otherwise, you've got one consumer and one commodity. So to have different consumers, you must have different goods and different income sources for the two consumers and different tastes. Otherwise, there's only one consumer. And taste must change with income. Otherwise, there's only one good. Okay? So therefore, with a two-consumer, two-commodity world, those are your initial conditions. You must have different income sources, you must have different tastes, and you must have taste changing with income. Now, let's imagine Crusoe and Friday are our two consumers, and coconuts and bananas are our two goods. And Crusoe owns the bananas, and Friday owns coconuts. I'm not looking at production here. That complicates things far more, of course, but it falls over even if you look at an initial endowment model. And regard coconuts as a necessity and bananas as the luxury. And I might argue that Friday has a higher preference for coconuts than does Crusoe. If you start with an arbitrary price ratio, like this, imposed on those indifference curves, and aggregate income remains constant, you don't change the number of coconuts or the number of bananas, and you consider a lower price for bananas, so you flatten the curve there, Crusoe, who's the banana income, is going to have his income fall, and Friday's is going to rise. So you can't, therefore, simply horizontally add those two across without changing the pivot points. And that ruins the logic that gives you a downward sloping demand curve. And it's quite possible then that market demand could fall for bananas because of the lower price for bananas, because Crusoe's income has fallen, and he's the banana producer. Friday's income rose, but he prefers bananas less than Crusoe does. So that price change could result, that the drop in price could cause a drop in demand, which violates the law of demand. Now you might want to cover that by using a Hicksian procedure here, by increasing all income, so you increase the number of coconuts and the number of bananas in proportion. So this sort of thing happens, and you increase it equally, keep them the same ratio. But the trouble is, banana demand will rise more than coconut demand as income rises because bananas are a luxury. So Crusoe's income will rise more than Friday's. So again, you can't do the income compensation effect that they like to do with individual demand curves. So a uniform increase in demand will also change the distribution of income. Now how can you get around those problems? Well, you have to assume there's one consumer and one commodity, which therefore contradicts your starting point of two consumers and two commodities. So market demand curves, let alone the entire economy, doesn't have to obey the law of demand. What they do, this is the madness of neoclassical economics, they build the representative consumer. And they have homothetic Engel curves, which means the tastes don't change with income. And they think that's rational. Now that's as rational as Pythagoreans assuming the square root of 2 is a ratio of two integers. If we did that, we wouldn't be standing in a building. Anything other than the Greeks could have built. There wouldn't be anything in the air other than birds. So you're contradicting the starting point, and that's a sign of immaturity and pre-scientism, let alone pre-science, of economic theory, neoclassical theory, that they'll hang on to this nonsense even though they've demolished its actual standing point. Now, very few of them reacted rationally, one being Alan Kerman, and his argument was that since it shows you can't aggregate the entire society, maybe at least you can aggregate groups that have coherent behaviour, which puts us back in the classical world of classes. So neoclassical theory proves the need for class-based analysis. And a few people like Kerman realise that. There are others who are rather madder. So I'll give you one of those. Saker and Sonnenschein again. This is in the Handbook of Mathematical Economics. It's not obscure research. It's not published in heterodox journals. It's in the mainstream. This is a book edited by Arrow and Trilogator. Strong restrictions are needed to justify the hypothesis that a market demand curve has the function of a consumer demand, market demand curve, let alone the entire economy. And of course, this isn't taught to neoclassical students. Most of them did this sort of nonsense. This is Gorman, who was the first person to find it, as I said, back in 1953. And he says, the necessary and sufficient conditions quoted above are intuitively reasonable. It says, in effect, that an extra unit of purchasing power should be spent in the same way, no matter to whom it is given. That's not intuitively reasonable. That's intuitively rubbish. But that's the sort of nonsense neoclassical students imbibe as they pass through their PhD courses. I'll show you one textbook example of that. This is an undergraduate textbook where Samuelson and Nordhaus say that you can get the market demand curve by adding up individual demand curves. And they say, does the market demand curve obey the individual? It certainly does. Garbage. It's provably false, that statement. Samuelson has his own way in which he proved it, and that, by the way, involves assuming that the entire economy operates as one big happy family, where everybody redistributes income prior to trade so that the ethical worth of every dollar is equalised. You know, as I say in the book, did the man even live in America? Come up with comments like that. Varium, this is the sort of vague stuff students used to get back in the 80s and 90s. Sometimes convenient. To think about aggregate demand as the demand of some representative consumer. He then says the conditions are rather stringent, but beyond the scope of this book, which would make most students who went through the course think, oh, well, it's difficult, but it can be done. I'll just assume a representative agent, I model the entire bloody economy, and off they go. And the real meaning is that macroeconomics is an emergent property. You can't model it using microeconomics. You can't deduce the entire economy from the behaviour of individual agents. And that's exactly what DSGE models do. And it's the fallacy of strong reductionism that, ironically, neoclassical economists themselves have disproved, but they don't realise that they've done it. So, and this is a common knowledge in sciences that the behaviour of large and complex aggregates can't be understood in terms of extrapolating individual particles. You need entirely new concepts at new levels of aggregation. So that's a common belief, common knowledge in other sciences, but they tried to do this as well and failed with reductionism. At some point, reductionism went an enormous distance in the physical sciences, of course, but at a certain point had to be abandoned to go beyond that. They were happy to do that because they weren't ideologically committed to the idea of rational individual particles and the teleological results that neoclassical theory ends up having. So they're quite happy to say in the physical sciences that science X is not just applied Y. At each stage you need new concepts, new generalisations, with new inspiration and new creativity just as great as in the previous ones. So they're aware of it. Now, the reasons neoclassicals continue believing this is because of poor scholarship, poor technique and ideology. And the poor scholarship is largely because they don't read their own literature. They rely upon the textbooks. Now, and they act therefore as if the theory has been vindicated without knowing that at the deep level the theory has been contradicted. So a major reason for writing Debunking Economics, first the first edition and now much more so the second, is to point out these elements of their own theories that they don't read and don't understand. So I'll skip some quotes there to show how bad they are to save a bit of time here. Now there are many, many fallacies in neoclassical theory on top of that particular one, like money neutrality, rational expectations. They're both used to reach the conclusion that capitalism is inherently stable and that the state can't improve market outcomes. And they're maintained even though you need patently false beliefs to handle it. Again, you can find this in the literature. Here's Friedman on money neutrality, saying nothing is as unimportant as the quantity of money in nominal terms. And under what conditions does that apply? He says so long as all other nominal magnitudes are multiplied by the same factor by which you change the amount of money. In other words, if inflation is 10%, banks increase your debt by 10%. We do not live on that planet. Therefore, money is not neutral. Rational expectations, according to Lucas, was brought in not as a sensible extension to bring expectations into economic theory, which Keynes did 70 years ago, but because you couldn't get the natural rate hypothesis unless you assumed there was no difference between actual inflation in the future and the expectations of inflation now. And he said the only way you can get that is to simply add it as an axiom. Let's just assume that expected inflation will be equal to actual inflation. Or assume expectations are rational in the sense of Muth. Now, if anything else, that says simply that Muth's idea of expectations is the capacity for accurate prophecy. That's what rational expectations really means. So we have an enormous amount of nonsense in neoclassical economics. It's wrong from first principles on a whole range of levels. It treats complex monetary exchanges as barter, assumes stability in an unstable system, ignores social class, obliterates uncertainty through believing every individual in this society has the capacity for accurate prophecy, which of course has now been proven wrong by the financial crisis that they themselves didn't see coming, and uses an empirically falsified model of money creation and ignores credit and debt. So we need a better macroeconomics than that, which is inherently monetary, models the economy dynamically, treats the system using social classes rather than isolated agents, has rational but not prophetic behaviour, and endogenous creation of money in which credit and debt have pivotal roles. And I've built a model like that using Minsky's financial instability hypothesis as a foundation. Again, to save time, I'll skip over some quotes from Minsky on that point, but they'll be in the presentation that I'll put on my blog. So Minsky's model starts with an economy in historical time, two elements of which, of course, are almost entirely lacking from neoclassical theory. In historical time, you have a debt-induced recession in the recent past, and that makes both firms and banks conservative about the amount of debt they'll take on, which means only conservative projects are funded. But because the economy's got through the crisis, which of course this time we haven't yet, and I don't think we will for a long time, recovery means most of those projects succeed. And that means firms and banks revise their risk premiums, increasing the level of debt they're willing to consider and revaluing assets upwards. And in Minsky's classic phrase, stability is destabilising because a period of tranquility causes expectations to rise. And that then leads to more investment, which causes the economy to grow faster. And it also leads to rising asset prices and therefore successful asset speculation and an increased willingness to supply money, which grows endogenously because the money system is endogenous, it's not controlled by the central bank. And ultimately you get Ponzi financiers turning up, who have a cash flow that's less than their debt servicing costs, but make a profit by selling assets on a rising market. And therefore rising debt levels, of course, a large part of the money being borrowed from non-profitable enterprises, because by definition Ponzi investment is not profitable, leading to a crisis, and often being triggered by non-Ponzi investors selling assets into what they think is a broad asset market, which then floods the market, and the trend of rising asset prices comes to an end. And the first ones to go bankrupt are the Ponzis because they can't service their debt unless they can sell their assets for a profit. Asset prices collapse, the endogenous expansion of the money supply goes into reverse, investment evaporates, and you're back where you started from. Now that's the basic verbal model of Minsky. And what the important point is, it's not just a cyclical model, it's also a secular one, because Minsky said there'd be a tendency for this whole process to restart once debt levels had fallen not quite back to where they started from, and if you'd reach a final crisis where debt overwhelmed the economy. Now an empirical example of that is what's called the Credit Accelerator. And this is new research, not related to Bernanke's idea of a financial accelerator, might add, because Bernanke argued the aggregate level of debt doesn't matter. That is empirically false, and I'm strictly contradicting it in the way I define the Credit Accelerator. Now the neoclassical belief is Walras' law that the sum of excess demands is zero. So therefore aggregate demand is essentially aggregate supply. And there's no role for credit in that vision. Both empirically and from the point of view of endogenous money, aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply, and aggregate demand equals aggregate supply plus the change in debt. The change in debt is an essential part of the demand for commodities and also for assets. So the change in aggregate demand, therefore, is the change in aggregate supply plus the acceleration of debt. And that's the fundamental trick that brings undone any financial bubble. And I'd find the Credit Accelerator, which is also originally called the Credit Impulse by Biggs, Meyer and Peck, to say where they first came from, is the acceleration in debt divided by GDP. And in this world, Walras' law is false. Now, that's a core proposition in Marx, Schumpeter and Minsky, and again, to save time, I'll skip over those quotes, but they're in the presentation there. So to empirically go through this, what you get now is aggregate, the balance which takes the place of Walras' law is aggregate demand is income plus the change in debt, which is equal to GDP plus net sales of assets. And breaking down what net sales of assets are, it's the price level of assets times the fraction sold times the quantity of assets. And therefore the change in aggregate demand is related to the change in GDP plus the acceleration of debt, and that therefore means the change in asset prices is affected by the acceleration of debt. You can find a correlation between the two. Now, neoclassical like Krugman, this is Krugman's most recent draft paper, not yet published, saying the overall level of debt makes no difference, making the same mistake that neoclassical have made all the way through of ignoring change in debt. And when you take a look at it, they're empirically wrong. Nice to be able to demolish them empirically as well as theoretically, because the Credit Accelerator is related to change in output, change in employment, and change in asset prices, and it leads them in time, since that is the basis of financing both investment and speculation. Now, to look back at the 1920s, and today, this is the level of debt compared to GDP, private debt in America. If anybody can't see the similarity, I recommend an optometrist. So bubbles of debt caused both the Great Depression and the Great Recession when they burst. And now looking at change in private debt and how that relates to economic activity, there's a graph of change in debt correlated with employment. Unemployment, I've turned unemployment upside down and graphed on the right-hand axis to show the correlation visually more clearly. That's back in the 1920s to 1940s. This is 1990 to now. The correlation back then, minus 0.79. The correlation now, minus 0.96. Okay? According to Neoclassical, that should be 0. Now, the differences between now and then, they do exist. There's a bigger boom in debt now than there was then. Of course, there's also been a much faster government response and a faster turnaround in the fall of private debt. Still falling, but its rate has slowed down. And now looking at the relation between the change in employment and the credit accelerator, that's the correlation. This is a correlation between a first order and a second order derivative in economic data. I didn't think I could find it, which is why I didn't look for it initially, why Bigmar and Peck beat me to finding it, but they're dead right. The correlation is there, even though you're looking at correlation of a first order to a second order change. Back in the 1920s, 20s to 40s, minus 0.5, now minus 0.75. That's across periods of both boom and bust. It's not just caught in one particular phase of the economic cycle. Now, the recent recovery in America, as you can see, is due in part to a decline in the rate, a slowdown in the rate of decline of private debt. Because even though debt's still falling, it's falling less rapidly, and therefore the acceleration has become positive. And the same data applies for the stock market. I'll skip that again in the interest of time. So I've now said we need an alternative macroeconomics, that it's possible to build one. And I've built one using a combination of Goodwin's growth cycle model and Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, plus the circuit theory of endogenous money creation coming out of Italy and France. And the product I now call monetary circuit theory. Now, the physical side is Goodwin's growth cycle model. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it actually puts into mathematical form what Marx argued back in the 1867 in first volume of Capital, chapter 25, section 3, I think it was. And in 1967, one century later, Goodwin converted into a mathematical model. So you have capital determining output via an accelerator, that determining employment via labour productivity, that labour productivity determining rate of employment giving population levels, that determines the rate of change of wages via a Phillips curve relation. You integrate wages and you therefore get the wage level when multiplied by labour. Subtract that from output, you get profits, and in the simple Goodwin model, all profits are invested. You integrate investment, and you get the change in capital, or investment is the change in capital. Integrate that, you get the capital stock. So it brings you back to the beginning again, and when you model it, you get a cyclical economy. The equilibrium is neither stable nor unstable. It's a neutral equilibrium. Now, I added to that in my 1995 paper on Minsky in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, but it was an implicit money model. So what I wanted to do was bring about a genuinely monetary model. And I've now found a way of doing that effectively using accounting, which is to start from the point of view that banks create money by issuing a loan and simultaneously issuing the money in the deposits. Loans create deposits. That's what we find empirically. It's what the Federal Reserve discovered itself back in the 60s when it tried to control the money supply. And I build this in a very simple way by having a tabular system I'll show you in a moment. But the basic idea of endogenous money is that money is created when an entrepreneur, preferably rather than a speculator, approaches a bank and gets a loan, and the bank issues a loan in money terms and records the debt simultaneously. So the simultaneous creation of both the deposits and the loans. And Alan Holmes, who was a vice president of the New York Fed, put it simply when he criticising saying why monetarism didn't work back in the 1930s, that banks don't need reserves to lend. They lend first, creating deposits in the process, and look for the reserves later. That's the actual process of money creation, and that puts new spending power into circulation. Now, modelling that, I input relationships in a table like this. So lending from reserves, for example, which I do have in the system, is a minus A from the reserve account, a plus A in the firm's deposit. Interest is then compounded on the debt. Payment of interest is a transfer from the firm's deposit to bank equity, and the firm then records that in a ledger operation, and so on. Now, the sums of those columns are a system of differential equations, and I have a system that now derives those automatically, which I've currently got a draft version of called QED, to show that model to you and to show it extended to the stage where I'm also modelling the financial crisis. If I can bring the player up here. This system is freely downloadable from my website and able to simulate a crisis like the one we've just been through. So there is, on the left-hand side, is what economists show as the great moderation. Inflation and unemployment both trending down, looking like heading towards a nice stable equilibrium for forevermore. But the fact that they're ignoring, which Minsky's theory suggests you take into account, is the rising level of debt to GDP, which is the top right-hand graph there. And as that level of debt rises, that changes the income distribution dynamics in the system and the accumulation dynamics, and ultimately that wonderfully performing economy starts to go very sick, with deflation taking place of inflation and unemployment starting to rise, so the great moderation becomes a great recession. And ultimately in the system, since I don't allow bankruptcy as yet in my modelling, the system collapses, which is the fate that America would have had if it hadn't done the enormous stimulus it's done and if you didn't have bankruptcy in the real system. So that's now freely available on my blog, as I've mentioned. If anyone wants to download it, and I've just received an INET grant to extend that and make it a more sophisticated system. And I'll be doing that over certainly the next year and several years after that. And when you look at it, this approach can explain the crisis. This is the smooth trends in inflation, unemployment, and the debt to GDP ratio in America from 1980 to now. I haven't attempted to calibrate my model yet, but I think I can argue qualitatively I've got much of the dynamics you can see in the real data. And I've embedded a paper based on that which is coming out in GBO later on this year. So just to skip to my concluding slide and hand over to the next presenter. If you want more on this details, Debunking Economics Edition 2 is coming out in September. Thank you.
Thank you.